At 7:33 p.m. Eastern on April 10, 2026, the Orion spacecraft did something it could never undo. It split itself in two. The European service module, the cylindrical section bolted beneath the crew capsule that had provided propulsion, electricity, water, air, and thermal control for the entire 10-day mission, disconnected from the crew module and drifted away. Within minutes, it would re-enter the atmosphere on its own trajectory and burn up over the Pacific Ocean. Everything it had done for the crew, every engine firing, every watt of solar power, every course correction across nearly 700,000 miles, was over. The service module was garbage now, expensive, irreplaceable garbage falling toward destruction in the upper atmosphere. What remained was the crew module, a gumdrop-shaped capsule roughly the size of a large SUV, coated on its base with a heat shield made of avcoat blocks, carrying 4 human beings who were now falling toward Earth at thousands of miles per hour. With no main engine, no solar panels, and no way to change their mind. From this moment forward, the Artemis 2 mission had exactly one option: down. The only question was the angle. 4 minutes after separation, at 7:37 p.m., the crew module's small reaction control thrusters fired for 18 seconds. NASA calls this the crew module raise burn. Its purpose sounds almost bureaucratic in the mission timeline: a final adjustment to set the proper entry angle and align the heat shield for atmospheric interface. That language disguises what is actually happening. Those 18 seconds aimed a capsule traveling at roughly 25,000 miles per hour at a specific corridor of atmosphere so narrow that the margin of error is measured in fractions of a degree. The burn adjusted the capsule's orientation, nudging its trajectory upward just enough to hit the atmosphere at the precise angle the engineers had calculated months ago. The angle that would keep the heat shield facing forward. The angle that would distribute the thermal load across the avcoat in the pattern the models predicted. The angle that would produce deceleration forces of 3.9 G instead of forces that would crush the crew or skip the capsule back into space. To understand why this burn matters more than almost anything else that happened on the mission, you need to understand the entry corridor. Every spacecraft returning from deep space faces the same fundamental problem. The capsule is approaching the Earth's atmosphere at a speed where the air itself becomes your enemy. At 25,000 miles per hour, roughly 35 times the speed of sound, the air molecules in front of the capsule cannot move out of the way. They compress, superheat, and ionize into plasma, reaching temperatures close to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat shield is designed to absorb and carry away that energy by charring and vaporizing in a controlled pattern. But the shield can only do its job if the capsule hits the atmosphere at the right angle. If the angle is too steep, the capsule plunges into thicker atmosphere too quickly. The deceleration forces spike beyond what the human body can withstand. The heating rate overwhelms the shield's ability to ablate in a controlled way. The structure fails. The crew dies. If the angle is too shallow, the capsule does not bite into the atmosphere deeply enough. It generates lift from its shape and skips off the upper atmosphere like a stone off water. Unlike a stone which comes back down, a capsule returning from the moon at this velocity can skip so high and so fast that Earth's gravity cannot recapture it. It flies over the horizon and into an orbit that may not intersect with the atmosphere again for hours or days, if ever. The crew would be alive, but stranded in a capsule with finite battery power, finite oxygen, and no way to slow down. That is not survival. That is a delayed death. The corridor between these two outcomes, the band of acceptable entry angles, is extraordinarily narrow. The capsule's guidance computer calculates the trajectory continuously, but the 18-second raise burn is the last physical input. After that, the capsule is on its own. The small thrusters can make minor adjustments to the angle of attack during descent, trimming the orientation to keep the heat shield pointed forward, but they cannot fundamentally change the trajectory. The path was set in those 18 seconds. Everything that happened afterward, the 5,000-degree heating, the 6-minute plasma blackout, the parachute deployment, the splashdown, all of it was a consequence of that burn. The Apollo engineers understood this corridor intimately. They called it the entry keyhole. On Apollo 13, when the service module's oxygen tank exploded and the crew had to use the lunar module as a lifeboat, the most terrifying calculation was not how to get back to Earth. The moon's gravity would handle that on the free return trajectory. The terrifying calculation was whether the damaged spacecraft could hit the entry corridor precisely enough to bring the crew home without burning up or skipping away forever. The guidance systems of 1970 were primitive by modern standards. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Mission Control ran the numbers over and over, each time arriving at the same conclusion. It was going to be close. The entry angle had to be within a half degree of the target. Anything outside that band and the crew was dead. They hit it. But the tension in that room during the final burn before re-entry is still considered one of the most stressful moments in the history of human spaceflight. Orion's computers are roughly 20,000 times faster than the Apollo guidance computer. The trajectory calculations are more precise. The reaction control thrusters are more reliable. But the physics has not changed. The atmosphere does not care how advanced your computer is. The entry corridor is still measured in fractions of a degree. The difference is that in 1970, the burn was a desperate correction by a crippled spacecraft. On April 10, 2026, it was a planned maneuver by a healthy spacecraft. The stakes were identical. The confidence was higher, but the consequences of getting it wrong were exactly the same. The hours leading up to the burn were methodical and quiet. The crew had woken up that morning to the sound of Run to the Water by Livin' Free by Zac Brown Band, chosen by the crew weeks before launch. They were 147,337 miles from Earth and closing fast. The day was consumed by checklists. They stowed loose equipment. They locked down anything that could become a projectile during re-entry G-forces. They repositioned their seats. They pulled on orthostatic intolerance garments, compression suits designed to keep blood from pooling in their legs when gravity returned after 10 days of weightlessness. Over those, they put on the orange Orion crew survival system suits, the same pressure suits they had worn at launch. At 2:53 in the afternoon, Orion fired its thrusters for 8 seconds in the third and final return trajectory correction burn, nudging the capsule's course by 4.2 feet per second. The last correction before the service module would be thrown away. The weather at the splashdown site was checked. 10-knot winds, 4-foot waves, scattered clouds. Within limits. The Pacific was cooperating. Everything from that point forward was about the final sequence, the separation, the burn, and the fall. At 5:05 in the afternoon, the crew began working the entry checklist, the final set of procedures that would carry them from orbit to ocean. Every switch, every system configuration, every valve position was reviewed and confirmed. The capsule had to be in exactly the right state before the service module was cut loose, because once it was gone, there was no fixing anything that depended on it. The life support would run on internal batteries. The cooling system would run on stored reserves. The guidance computer would navigate using its own sensors. The crew would rely on the training they had rehearsed hundreds of times in the Orion mission simulator at Johnson Space Center, where they had practiced every failure mode the engineers could imagine, including scenarios where the raise burn did not fire at all. Victor Glover, the mission's pilot, told reporters 2 days before re-entry that he had been thinking about this moment since April 3rd, 2023, the day the crew was announced. 3 years. That is how long entry had occupied a corner of his mind. Not the launch, not the lunar flyby, not the record-breaking distance from Earth. The entry, the burn, the angle, the shield. When the moment came, he described it simply. Riding a fireball through the atmosphere is profound. At 7:37 p.m., the thrusters ignited. For 18 seconds, small jets of hydrazine pushed against the capsule, tilting its trajectory by an increment so small that no human sense could have detected it. The crew would not have felt it. There was no dramatic shudder, no roar of engines, just a faint vibration, a brief notation on the cockpit displays, and then silence. The burn was complete. The trajectory was set. The capsule was aimed. 16 minutes later, it was over. Orion hit the atmosphere at 7:53 p.m., traveling at 39,693 kilometers per hour. A plasma sheath formed within seconds. The windows glowed orange, then white. G-forces climbed to 3.9 times normal gravity, pressing the crew into seats they had been strapped into for hours. Communications went dark for 6 minutes. In Houston, Rick Henfling and his team sat at consoles showing nothing, counting seconds, watching a clock the way Gene Kranz's team had watched a clock during Apollo 13, the way Mission Control had watched during every Apollo re-entry, the way they had watched during Artemis work. Waiting. At 7:59 p.m., the signal punched back through the thinning plasma. The crew was alive. The shield had held. At 8:03 p.m., drogue parachutes deployed at 22,000 feet. At 8:04 p.m., 3 main parachutes unfurled at 6,000 feet. At 8:07 p.m., the capsule hit the Pacific Ocean at 20 miles per hour, roughly 50 miles off the coast of San Diego. Commander Reed Wiseman's first words after splashdown were simple: "What a journey." The service module was gone. The heat shield was charred. The parachutes were floating in the ocean. The batteries were draining. But the capsule was upright, the crew was conscious, and the signal was strong. Within an hour, Navy divers from the USS John P. Murtha were alongside the capsule. They measured the air around the spacecraft for ammonia and other hazardous chemicals from the cooling system. Once cleared, they attached tow lines and began guiding the capsule toward the ship's well deck. Before the crew was extracted, before anyone opened the hatch, divers slipped into the water with cameras and photographed the heat shield from below. Those images, taken within minutes of splashdown, were the first data points in what will be a months-long investigation into whether the Avcoat performed as the models predicted, or whether it cracked again. Christina Koch was the first to emerge from the capsule. She waved. Jeremy Hansen walked to the medical bay under his own power, smiling broadly. Victor Glover did the same, steady on his feet after 10 days without gravity. Wiseman came last, looking relieved, looking like a man who had been carrying a weight for 3 years and had just set it down. 2 heat shield experts were already aboard the Murtha, waiting to inspect the capsule the moment it was hoisted from the water. Howard Hu, NASA's Orion program manager, said during the post-splashdown press conference that they had gathered a lot of data and would need several days to determine if anything anomalous had occurred. The capsule would eventually be transported back to Kennedy Space Center in Florida for detailed scans. The answer to the biggest question of the mission, whether the trajectory change fixed the heat shield problem, was sitting on the bottom of a charred capsule, bobbing in the Pacific, and it would take weeks to know for certain. Think about what was thrown away to get to that moment. The solid rocket boosters were gone 2 minutes after launch, dropped into the Atlantic. The core stage engines were gone 8 minutes in. The interim cryogenic propulsion stage was jettisoned after the translunar injection burn. The launch abort system was discarded. And finally, on April 10th, the service module itself was cut loose and burned up over the Pacific. One by one, every component of the 322-foot rocket that had carried 4 people off the surface of the Earth was stripped away until nothing remained but a capsule roughly 16 feet across, a heat shield 5 meters wide, and the 18 seconds that aimed it at the only corridor that could bring it home. But here is what most people will never think about. At 7:37 p.m., when those thrusters fired for 18 seconds, there was no celebration, no cheering, no applause. It was a line item in a timeline, a brief burn in a long sequence of brief burns, noted and confirmed and moved past. The crew felt almost nothing. The displays updated, the trajectory locked in. And in that invisible moment, the lives of 4 people were committed to a path that could not be altered, through an atmosphere that does not forgive, at a speed that turns air into fire, protected by a shield that had already failed once before. 18 seconds, no abort, no second chance. The difference between coming home and not coming home reduced to a whisper of thrust in the vacuum of space, so quiet the crew could barely tell it happened. That is what spaceflight actually looks like in the moments that matter most. Not thunder and fire, not dramatic countdowns, just a small burn, a locked trajectory, and the absolute trust that the math was right. If you want to keep exploring what the universe is really doing, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.